these borderland regions enable forms of activity and accumulation and extraction to then feed the processes of growth in these metropolitan centers. So the war economies and the peace economies are symbiotic related to each other. And so from the perspective of the hub, and where the peace economy, these war zones are less problems to be dealt with than opportunities to be exploited. So, for example, in what we're looking at in Myanmar is how rare earth mining extraction in the borderlands of Myanmar is feeding China's green energy transition. We're interested in how the illicit drug economy is creating flows of capital that get invested in Kunming. And we're interested in how scam centers are also leading to processes of accumulation, and that may be funding developments in Kunming. So there's interesting work being done by people like Alex de Waal now, who's talking about global war economies and how these symbiotic relationships develop.
It's interesting, this idea, and then maybe it can go into a philosophical thing. If there's a bad thing happening somewhere that is helping a good thing happening somewhere else, is it justified, and should we keep it going? But I don't have the answer to that. And then also this idea of global war economy is interesting as the globalized world and stuff. And I think maybe we can really see that with Ukraine. I don't know what you think about that, but how this one conflict led to a whole kind of unified, almost effort about this war economy. And also now with every change that happened with Trump, you had the EU that's also said that we're essentially, gonna put a lot more effort into manufacturing weapons and this and that. So what is your take on Ukraine, its war economy, and do you feel like there's a way out? And another point on that, talking about war economies and the messed up incentives that happen, people talk about how, when there's war happen, there's a lot of destruction happen, but after that, people get, big contracts to rebuild the broken country. So a lot of messed up incentives at play, but I guess what is your take on that? Sorry if I put in a lot of things there.
A lot of things, and not all of them I'm qualified to say anything of any authority on. But I think the point about that good things happen in one place and bad things in another. Let's kind of take that a little bit more. And I mean, it's part of a very old kind of story of, that has been extensively written about the combined and uneven nature of development. And so the kind of this hypothesis we want to explore is that these kind of war economies in the borderlands, the global borderlands, if you like, in the peripheries of states and of the global economy, they're not the result of being disconnected or being left behind. These are places that are highly connected in lots of different ways, and the drug economy is a good example of that. Global migration is another. Organized crime, that's another. The key thing is about, what David Harvey writes about is challenging this diffusionist narrative that basically, to deal with these disordered faults of progress, just build these connections to extend markets, to extend states. And what our work is arguing that these places are connected, but it's adverse incorporation. They're integrated in terms that work against these areas. So we're trying to kind of purposely place attention and focus on how these integrative processes have these devastating effects, whether it's the extractive kind of processes around rare earth mining, which leaves toxic environments behind, and the major benefits go to China and so on. And so it's trying to think carefully about how so-called pathologies of the margins, the reasons for those pathologies don't lie there often. They lie, whether it's London, whether it's Nairobi, whether it's Dubai. So that leads to some kind of difficult kinds of questions about, so for example, banking systems and the flows of resources into Dubai, the laundering of money. It leads to questions about how places like Afghanistan have been intervened in and policed and subject to these kinds of policies, whether it's the war on terror, whether it's the war against drugs, how they, so thinking more carefully about distributional effects, not just within these peripheral areas, but at a kind of global level. Going back to this question, I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about Ukraine in any substantive way, but I think there's some interesting work that Alex de Waal has been contributing to, firstly about political marketplaces in the global south, but he's tried to extend that analysis to thinking about war economies at a global level. And his basic argument is that from the kind of the end of towards the end of the Cold War through to about 2010 or so, there was a kind of an American-dominated, Pax Americana kind of global war economy. Huge investment in the industrial military complex, development kind of linked to the dollar, linked also to a whole kind of counterinsurgency doctrine about stabilizing areas and so on. And he's arguing that since 2010 or so, that this has been challenged by the BRICS, by China, and attempts to de-dollarization, and so there's a kind of contestation going on about at a global level around the control of the economy, and a collapse of the kind of the so-called liberal consensus. And I guess these things are playing out in places like Ukraine now, and I mean, there is a kind of evident that's kind of very big kind of picture and probably quite generalized. But I think that when we think about war economies, I think we need to kind of extend it beyond these kinds of areas in the global south that are affected by war. It kind of tracks back to a lot of other processes going on in kind of metropoles.